The sun rose over the village of Abney, casting a golden glow over the lush green fields and winding dirt paths. Roosters crowed from thatched rooftops, and the scent of freshly baked bread wafted through the air. Children laughed as they ran barefoot across the open courtyards, their voices mingling with the rhythmic pounding of pestles against mortars as women prepared the day's meals. Life in Abney was simple, yet it thrived with a vibrancy that only a close-knit community could offer. Amina sprinted down the dusty path leading to the river, her bare feet kicking up tiny clouds of red earth. She was late, again. Her best friend, Tenny, would surely scold her for keeping her waiting. But Amina was used to this. She had always been the dreamer, often losing herself in the tales her grandmother shared or the vivid daydreams that played out in her mind. "Where have you been?" Tenny asked, hands on her hips as Amina skidded to a halt near the riverbank. "The water isn't going to fetch itself." Amina grinned sheepishly, grabbing her clay pot. "I was helping Mama with the bread," she lied. Tenny rolled her eyes, but couldn't stay mad for long. Together, they waded into the cool, clear water, filling their pots while chattering about the upcoming village festival. The festival was the highlight of the year in Abney. Drummers and dancers would gather in the village square, and storytellers would weave tales of bravery and wisdom late into the night. Amina loved those stories more than anything. She often imagined herself as the heroine, standing tall and proud, overcoming challenges with wit and courage. As the girls returned to the village, balancing pots of water on their heads, they passed by the bustling market. Vendors called out their wares: ripe mangoes, dried fish, vibrant fabrics, and the air buzzed with life. Amina's mother, Adunni, stood at her stall, selling freshly baked loaves of bread. She waved at Amina with flour-dusted hands, her warm smile a source of comfort and pride. "Don't dawdle, Amina," Adunni called. "Your father will be home soon, and we need to prepare supper." "Yes, Mama," Amina replied, quickening her pace. That evening, as the family gathered for supper, the warm glow of the oil lamp lit their modest home. Amina's father, Bala, recounted stories from his day in the fields, his deep voice filling the room. Her younger brothers giggled as they played with their food, earning a stern glance from their mother. Life in Abney was far from perfect. The village faced its share of challenges: unpredictable rains, meager harvests, and the ever-present shadow of poverty. Yet, the strength of the community and the bonds of family made it resilient. As Amina lay on her mat that night, staring at the stars through the open window, she felt a sense of peace. The world outside her village was vast and unknown, but within Abney, she felt safe, surrounded by love and tradition. The morning started like any other in Abney. Amina was helping her mother knead dough in the small, warm kitchen when a distant sound of laughter and a cart's rattling wheels broke the routine. Curious, she peeked through the wooden window slats and saw a figure climbing down from the cart at the village square. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in city clothes that seemed out of place in the humble village. He carried a brown leather bag slung over his shoulder and a wide grin that revealed perfectly white teeth. "Mama, who's that?" Amina asked, her hands dusted with flour. Adunni turned to look and gasped. "That's your Uncle Bayo," she exclaimed, quickly wiping her hands on her apron. "Uncle Bayo?" Amina repeated, trying to recall him. "Yes, my younger brother. He's been in the city for years. I didn't know he was coming today." Adunni's voice was a mixture of excitement and surprise. She quickly left the kitchen, beckoning Amina to follow. By the time they reached the square, a small crowd had gathered around Bayo. His city charm was evident as he greeted everyone with handshakes and laughter. He had brought small gifts, colorful scarves, sweets, and a radio, which he distributed generously, earning more than a few smiles from the villagers. "Adunni," he called out, opening his arms wide. "Bayo." Adunni rushed forward, embracing her brother tightly. It had been years since they had seen each other, and the joy on her face was unmistakable. "And this must be Amina," Bayo said, turning to the girl who stood shyly behind her mother. He crouched to her level, his smile warm and inviting. "You've grown so much." The last time I saw you, you were just a baby. Amina nodded, unsure of what to say. Well, aren't you going to give your uncle a hug? Adani prompted. Amina hesitated but stepped forward and allowed Bayo to hug her. His cologne smelled strong and unfamiliar, a stark contrast to the earthy scents of her father and the villagers. Don't be shy, Bayo said, patting her head. We're family. Over the next few days, Bayo quickly became a fixture in their household. His charm and wit made him popular among the villagers, and he often regaled them with tales of city life. He spoke of tall buildings that touched the clouds, cars that moved faster than horses, and opportunities that seemed endless. Amina was fascinated by his stories. She would sit cross-legged in the courtyard, listening intently as he painted vivid pictures of a world far removed from her own. I'll take you to the city someday, Bayo promised one evening. You're a bright girl, Amina. You'd do well there. Her eyes lit up at the thought. She had always dreamed of seeing what lay beyond Abani's borders. But while Amina found herself drawn to her uncle's stories, her father, Bala, remained cautious. He watched Bayo with a quiet wariness, his gaze lingering a little too long. During mealtime conversations. City life changes people, Bala said to Adani one night as they prepared for bed. Let's hope Bayo hasn't forgotten where he came from. You worry too much, Adani replied. He's family, Bala. And family is everything. Bayo's presence brought a whirlwind of excitement to Amina's otherwise predictable days. Yet, even in the laughter and newness, there was a quiet unease that Bala couldn't shake, a shadow that flickered just beyond the light. Life in Abani continued its familiar rhythm, but for Amina, Uncle Bayo's presence added a new layer of fascination. When he wasn't mingling with the villagers or helping her mother with chores, Bayo spent time teaching Amina and her brothers about the wonders of the world beyond the village. The stars you see at night, he said one evening as the family gathered under the open sky, are much closer when you stand in the city. There are machines that can take you above the clouds to touch them. Machines? Amina's youngest brother, Kunal, asked, wide-eyed. Yes, airplanes, Bayo said with a dramatic flourish. Amina giggled, imagining herself flying among the stars. She loved Bayo's stories, they filled her with dreams of adventure and possibility. Yet her days remained grounded in the village's simplicity. Each morning, she woke to the rooster's call, fetched water from the river, and helped her mother bake bread. After chores, she would meet Tenny, and together, they'd play games under the baobab tree or weave baskets from palm fronds. Do you think you'll ever leave Abani? Tenny asked one afternoon as they sat by the river, their feet dangling in the cool water. I don't know, Amina replied thoughtfully. I love it here, but Uncle Bayo says there's so much more to see. I'd rather stay here, Tenny said firmly. The city sounds too noisy. Amina smiled but didn't respond. She couldn't explain the curiosity that burned within her, the desire to see what lay beyond the hills that framed their village. In the evenings, her family gathered around the hearth. Bala would share stories of his youth, while Adani hummed softly as she sewed. Bayo often added his own tales, filling their home with laughter and wonder. One night, as they sat together, Bayo leaned close to Amina. You remind me of your mother when she was young, he said, his voice warm. Really? Amina asked, beaming. Yes, Bayo replied. She was curious and full of dreams, just like you. The compliment made Amina's chest swell with pride. She adored her mother and hoped to one day embody the same strength and grace. Despite his charm, Bayo's presence sometimes disrupted the household's harmony. He often teased Bala for his traditional ways, calling him old-fashioned. Bala would laugh it off, but Amina noticed the tension in her father's eyes. Your uncle thinks he knows everything because he's been to the city, Bala muttered one night to Adani. He doesn't mean any harm, Adani reassured him. But Bala's unease persisted. He kept a close watch on Bayo, though he never said why. For Amina, Bayo's arrival was a gift. She saw him as a link to a bigger, brighter world. Yet, in her innocence, she didn't notice the subtle shifts around her, the moments when her father's smiles faltered or when her mother's gaze lingered on Bayo a little too long. The days passed in a haze of stories, chores, and laughter. Amina's world felt safe, sheltered by the love of her family and the warmth of her community. She had no way of knowing that beneath the surface of her idyllic life, shadows were beginning to gather, shadows that would soon change everything. The weeks following Uncle Bayo's arrival brought subtle but undeniable changes to Ebony's quiet rhythm. At first, they were easy to dismiss, small moments that seemed inconsequential on the surface, but left a faint unease in their wake. Bayo had become a favorite among the children in the village. He would gather them in the evenings, telling tales of the city and teaching them songs with unfamiliar melodies. Amina's brothers adored him, and even her best friend, Tenny, found herself captivated by his stories. Yet, Amina began noticing things she didn't understand. One afternoon, as she carried water from the river, she felt Bayo's eyes on her. It wasn't unusual for him to watch her, but this time, his gaze lingered. She glanced over her shoulder, and he quickly looked away, flashing his usual warm smile. "You're growing up so fast," he said, his voice soft, but oddly heavy. "Soon, you'll be a young woman." Amina didn't know how to respond, so she smiled politely and hurried back to the house. The comment stuck with her, but she brushed it off. Bayo had always been kind and generous. He was family, why would she feel uneasy around him? That evening, Bala returned home earlier than usual. He seemed preoccupied, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by a quiet tension. "Everything all right, Papa?" Amina asked as she helped set the table for supper. Bala nodded but didn't meet her eyes. "Just tired," he said. Adani noticed his mood and tried to lift his spirits with playful teasing, but her efforts were met with a forced smile. During the meal, Bayo dominated the conversation as usual, sharing tales of his city escapades. Bala ate in silence, his eyes fixed on his plate. Amina's brothers laughed at Bayo's jokes, and even Adani seemed charmed, but Amina couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled over her. Over the next few days, Bayo's behavior grew more peculiar. He began offering to help Amina with her chores, something he hadn't done before. At first, she welcomed the assistance, but soon, his presence felt intrusive. One morning, as they worked side by side kneading dough, Bayo placed his hand over hers. "You're doing it wrong," he said, his voice gentle, but insistent. Amina froze, her heart beating faster. "I know how to do it, Uncle," she said, pulling her hand away. Bayo chuckled. "Just trying to help," he said, his tone light, but his eyes didn't match his smile. She excused herself and went outside, feeling an unease she couldn't explain. The tension came to a head one evening when Bala confronted Adeni after supper. "Bayo needs to leave soon," Bala said, his voice low but firm. Adeni looked up, surprised. "Why?" "He's family. He's only been here a few weeks." Bala hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "I don't trust him," he finally said. Adeni frowned. "You're overreacting. Bayo has done nothing but help since he arrived." "I see things you don't," Bala replied, his tone sharp. The argument escalated, their voices rising as Amina and her brothers listened from the courtyard. She had never heard her parents argue like this, and it frightened her. Eventually, Bala stormed out of the house, leaving Adeni sitting by the fire, her face tense with frustration. Later that night, as Amina lay in bed, she replayed the day's events in her mind. The unease she felt around Bayo was growing, but she couldn't bring herself to speak of it. After all, he was her uncle, her mother's brother. Surely, he meant no harm. But as the wind howled outside her window, carrying the distant sounds of the village, Amina couldn't shake the feeling that her safe and innocent world was beginning to crack. Something was shifting, and she didn't know how to stop it. The days grew hotter as the dry season settled over Ebony, and with it came a sense of suffocating stillness. Amina's unease deepened, yet she couldn't find the courage to voice her growing discomfort. Uncle Bayo was still a figure of charm and hospitality in the village, but for Amina, something had changed. It was on a particularly quiet afternoon when the first true sign of danger came. Amina had been asked to help her mother with the laundry, but when she went to the back of the house, she found that her mother had stepped out to visit a neighbor. The house was empty, and a strange silence had settled in the air. She went to the well to fetch water, but on her way back, she saw Bayo standing by the door, his back to her as he watched the villagers go about their business. A small chill ran down Amina's spine as she approached. "Amina, come here," Bayo called, his voice as smooth as ever, but there was an undercurrent to it that she couldn't place. She hesitated but walked toward him. As she neared, Bayo turned and smiled, a smile that, for some reason, made her stomach turn. "Uncle Bayo?" Amina asked, feeling the unease rise in her chest. "What is it?" "I've been thinking about you," he said, his voice soft and slow. "You're growing into such a beautiful young woman." Amina froze. The words lingered in the air between them, thick and uncomfortable. She didn't respond. Her feet felt rooted to the earth, but she wanted to pull away. "Come inside, Amina," Bayo said, his smile widening. "I want to show you something." I need to help Mama," Amina stammered, stepping back. Bayo stepped forward, reaching out to touch her arm. The touch was light, but it felt too heavy, too wrong. "Amina," he said again, his voice low and coaxing. "You're not a child anymore. You don't have to hide from me. I'm your family, and family looks out for each other." The words rang hollow in her ears, but before she could say anything, a loud noise from the village square interrupted them. Amina jerked away from his grasp, her heart pounding in her chest. I need to go," she stammered, backing away quickly. She didn't wait for his response, turning and running toward the safety of the open square, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The next few days were filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. Amina couldn't shake the image of Bayo's smile, his touch, the way he had made her feel small and powerless. But when she tried to speak to her mother, the words caught in her throat. She couldn't explain what had happened, not in a way that would make sense to anyone. How could she, when even she didn't fully understand it? That evening, as the family gathered for supper, Amina's father sat unusually still, his hands clenched tightly around his bowl. Adani tried to fill the silence with small talk, but Amina could sense the tension in the air. Bayo, as always, was the first to speak. "I think it's time I return to the city," he said, his voice casual. "I've overstayed my welcome, haven't I?" Amina looked up in surprise. She hadn't expected him to leave so soon. "No, you've been a great help," Adani said quickly, her voice tight with an unreadable emotion. "I agree with your mother," Bala said, his voice low but firm. "You're always welcome here, Bayo." But his words were not as warm as they had once been. Amina could feel her father's suspicion radiating from him, like a storm on the horizon. Later that night, as Amina lay in bed, the house quiet except for the faint sounds of her brother's breathing, she felt a weight settle on her chest. She had been taught to trust her elders, to believe in the goodness of family, but what had happened in the past few days had shaken that belief to its core. She felt dirty. Ashamed. And the shame twisted inside her like a knife. For the first time in her young life, she understood that the people she loved and trusted could hurt her, could betray her in ways that were far too confusing to fully comprehend. But the worst part was that no one would believe her. The next morning, Amina woke with a deep, unshakable sense of dread. She avoided Bayo all day, refusing to meet his eyes, her heart pounding each time he spoke her name. When her mother asked why she was so quiet, Amina forced a smile, but inside, she felt herself unraveling. Uncle Bayo was leaving, but the damage he had done lingered like a shadow in the corners of her mind. And though she longed to tell someone, to scream out the truth, she remained silent, afraid of what would happen if she spoke. It wasn't until that evening, when she could no longer bear the weight of her silence, that Amina finally found the courage to tell someone who would listen. It wasn't her mother. It wasn't her father. It was Tenny. That night, under the same baobab tree where they had played for so many years, Amina took Tenny's hand, her voice trembling as she spoke the words she had kept hidden for so long. The truth came pouring out, about Bayo's words, his touch, the unease that had been building inside her. Tenny's face turned pale as she listened, and when Amina finished, her friend didn't speak at first. "Amina, you should have told someone," Tenny said softly. "You shouldn't have kept this to yourself." "I was scared," Amina whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't know who to trust." "You can trust me," Tenny said, her voice firm. "And we'll make sure you're safe." But even as Tenny spoke those comforting words, Amina could feel the weight of what was to come. Uncle Bayo's betrayal had shattered more than just her sense of safety, it had shaken the very foundation of her world. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel for more stories.